"Pack your bags. You're leaving for this place tomorrow," my son-in-law barked, tossing a crumpled brochure for a nursing home onto the dining table. The brochure smelled of stale air and abandonment. "My name is Eleanor Vance, and I'm 73 years old. I make my living by repairing antique clocks, breathing life back into mechanisms others have given up for dead." What he forgot was that the deeds to this house, the very one he stomped around with such arrogant disregard, were locked away in my workshop, ready to be deployed. The brochure was printed on that cheap, glossy paper that slips through your fingers, saturated with fake cheer that no sane person would ever believe. It landed with a soft thump right on my plate, staining the rim with a trace of the stew I had simmered all afternoon. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't immediately avert my gaze. I simply watched the paper's trajectory, the way it settled. Then I lifted my eyes to Robert. He stood on the other side of the table, chest puffed out, breathing with that characteristic heaviness of a man who's just made a cowardly decision and needs to convince himself it was an act of bravery. Beside him, my daughter, Susan, kept her eyes glued to the linen tablecloth, tracing the outline of an embroidered pattern with her index finger, utterly unable to meet my stare. The silence that settled in the dining room wasn't an empty one. It was the dull clang of an irreparable fracture, the sound of an internal clock whose mainspring had just snapped. To understand how we arrived at this precise moment, this sauce-stained brochure on my oak table, one must rewind and observe the pieces of the mechanism. My mind has always worked like this, cataloging events, measuring tensions, analyzing the wear and tear of gears before the machine collapses. My late husband, Thomas, used to say I had ice in my veins and a caliper in my brain. When he passed away 15 years ago, I didn't collapse into theatrical tears. I organized the funeral, paid off outstanding debts, filed his documents in meticulously labeled folders, and continued to maintain this two-story house we built brick by brick in 1978. This house isn't just a roof, it's a material record of my existence. I know the exact creak of the third wooden stair leading to the second floor. I know how many minutes it takes for the water to warm up in the master bathroom's pipes. I know the angle of the sunlight when it pours through the living room bay window at 4 p.m. in the dead of winter, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. Robert and Susan moved in 3 years and 4 months ago. I know the date exactly because I wrote it in the margin of my ledger. They arrived with a half-empty moving truck, my daughter's face pale, my grandson, Ethan, clutching a blue backpack, and my son-in-law's grandiose speech about a temporary transition. Robert's import business had failed. It wasn't due to bad luck, or the economy, or market conspiracies, as he incessantly repeated. It failed due to pure, simple mathematical incompetence. I had silently and unasked reviewed the balance sheets he carelessly left on the kitchen table. He spent more on business dinners and custom suits than on inventory. He was a man of appearances, a plastic mechanism wrapped in a gilded casing trying to pass for solid gold. I said nothing then. I opened my door to them. I gave them the guest room. Then I allowed them to occupy the sewing room for Ethan's toys. Slowly, methodically, silently, they began to colonize my spaces. The invasion was gradual, like moisture creeping up a poorly sealed wall. First, it was the schedule. The entire house had to adapt to Robert's erratic rhythm. He'd rise at noon, demanding absolute silence all morning because, according to him, he worked until dawn scouting investors online. Then, it was the meals. Susan, exhausted from her double shifts at an insurance office to cover her husband's financial holes, stopped cooking. I took on that task, not out of submission, but out of efficiency, and because Ethan needed proper nutrition. I prepared breakfasts, lunches, dinners, washed the dishes, ironed school uniforms with the precision of someone adjusting a chronometer's needle. Every one of Ethan's shirts had perfect creases. Every morning, I was up at 5:30, grinding coffee, toasting bread, organizing the day before the rest of the house even opened its eyes. My labor was completely invisible to them. Robert consumed the meals I placed before him without so much as a thank you, often complaining the meat was overcooked or he preferred another brand of coffee. "You're getting old, Eleanor," he'd say with that condescending smile, wiping his mouth with the cloth napkin I had washed and starched myself. "You don't understand how the world works now." It's all about speed, all about risk. You're stuck in the last century with your winding gadgets. I listened without altering my expression. I collected his plate, carried it to the sink, and mentally noted another overdue bill the mailman had left that morning addressed to him, another collection notice he'd hide under the fruit bowl. My silence was never weakness, it was simply data collection. An investigator doesn't interrupt a crime scene to scold the thief, they simply document. The only place in the house that remained untouched was my workshop. It's located in the back, next to the lemon tree's patio. It's a small room with a solid wood workbench full of tiny compartments, cool light lamps, and magnifying loupes. I spend my afternoons there, surrounded by precision tweezers, millimeter-sized screwdrivers, and minuscule vials of lubricant. Clock repair is a trade that tolerates no deception. If a part is worn, the clock stops. You can't convince a gear with motivational speeches or promises of modern business. It demands truth, patience, and an absolutely steady hand. From my workshop window, I have a clear view of the street and the neighborhood life that has flourished around me for 4 decades. I know everyone. I know Martha, who runs the corner market and saves me the best tomatoes. I know the kids at the pharmacy, and especially I know Mr. Henderson, the owner of the real estate agency 3 blocks away. A serious man with whom Thomas and I shared countless Sundays in the town square. My life is woven into the fabric of these streets. I am not an isolated old woman in a bubble. I am a central node in a community that Robert, in his infinite arrogance, disdains as provincial. The tension reached its critical point earlier this month. Robert had been more irritable than usual. His supposed investors had stopped returning his calls. Debts were closing in. He started looking at the house differently. He no longer saw it as a temporary refuge, but as an underutilized asset. I noticed it in the way he measured the spaces with his gaze, and how he tapped the hallway walls, as if calculating which ones to tear down. One afternoon, Susan came into my workshop. She was pale, with deep dark circles under her eyes, her once vibrant face now drawn. She wrung her hands nervously, avoiding my direct gaze. She told me they needed more space, that Ethan was growing up, that Robert needed a proper office to finalize his projects and get out of this rut. She suggested, with the trembling voice of someone reciting an imposed script, that the house was too big for me alone, that perhaps I would be more comfortable in a smaller place where I wouldn't have to worry about maintenance. I lowered the loupe from my eye, set the tweezers on the green felt mat, and looked at her steadily. I didn't argue. I simply asked in a neutral voice who would pay for this supposed smaller place if they couldn't even cover the current month's electricity bill. Susan lowered her head and left the workshop without answering. That was the prelude, the confirmation that the mechanism of our cohabitation was about to collapse. And so we arrived at tonight, Thursday. It was 57 degrees outside. Dinner was served. I had prepared stew, Ethan's favorite. Though the boy was in his room finishing homework and hadn't come down yet, Robert sat at the table without washing his hands. He wore a shirt I had ironed that very morning. Susan served water, avoiding noise with the glasses. The atmosphere was thick, charged with that static electricity that precedes a dry thunderstorm. Robert took a couple of bites, chewed without enthusiasm, and then dropped his silverware onto the plate, making a metallic, aggressive clang. He leaned back in his chair, crossed his arms, and fixed his eyes on me. "Eleanor," he began, using that tone of false respect that always preceded a demand. "I've been crunching numbers. This situation isn't sustainable anymore. The house is old, it needs repairs you can't afford, and we need to expand. I have a project on the horizon that requires me to host clients here, and frankly, the atmosphere isn't suitable." I continued cutting a small piece of meat. My movements were unhurried. I met his eyes, waiting for him to finish his rehearsed monologue. "Susan and I have made a decision," he continued. I noticed my daughter shrinking a little further in her chair as her name was included in that pronouncement. "It's for your own good. You need to rest. You need a place where you'll be taken care of, where you won't have to worry about cooking or cleaning. You're already an elderly person. You're an impediment to this family's progress if you cling to a house that's too big for you." The word hung in the air. Impediment. An interesting term. Coming from a man who had lived under my roof for 39 months, eating my food, using my hot water, and sleeping in beds I bought. A man whose only demonstrable income in the last 3 years had been the lies he told his wife. I didn't feel emotional indignation. I felt the cold certainty of a confirmed diagnosis. My analysis was correct. The parasite had decided it was time to devour the host to survive. It was then that he reached into his jacket's inner pocket and pulled out the paper. He unfolded it with a sharp movement and threw it onto the table. The brochure slid across the tablecloth until it hit my plate. Sunset Retirement Residences, it read in gold cursive, accompanied by a photograph of elderly people smiling in a synthetic garden. I knew exactly what place it was. It was on the outskirts of the city. A repository for forgotten seniors, state-funded, known for its understaffing and smell of industrial disinfectant. It was the cheapest place he could find. "Pack your bags. You're leaving for this place tomorrow," he declared, emphasizing each syllable to assert authority. "I called this afternoon, and they have a bed available. We've decided to mortgage this house to inject capital into my new venture. You'll sign the deed transfer papers tomorrow morning before you leave. Don't worry, I'll handle the paperwork." The silence that followed was absolute. I could hear the tick-tock of the wall clock behind me. It was a pendulum clock I had adjusted myself a decade ago. It lost barely 2 seconds a month. I looked at the brochure. Then I looked at Susan, my daughter, the girl I had taught to read. The woman I had held when she cried from exhaustion kept her head bowed. There was no surprise on her face. She knew. She had consented. The weight of that betrayal stung, of course, but my analytical mind quickly encapsulated the pain to process later. In this moment, there was no room for tears. There was an operational problem to solve. "Are you okay with this, Susan?" I asked. My voice was clear, without a tremor, with the precision of a scalpel. She swallowed hard, moved her lips a couple of times before the sound emerged. "Mom, Robert is right. It's for the best for everyone. We need the money from the house to get by. You'll be well cared for there. We'll visit you on Sundays." I nodded slowly, a single movement of my head. The evidence was complete. The case was closed. Robert looked at me with a half smile, convinced that my lack of hysteria was a sign of surrender. He expected screams. He expected pleas. He expected the fragility of a frightened old woman. He didn't understand that my calm was the result of knowing exactly how many cards I held and knowing the rules of the game better than he did. "Tomorrow," I repeated in a whisper, almost to myself. "First thing tomorrow," he confirmed, rapping his knuckles on the table. "So I suggest you start packing your things. You don't need to take much. They'll give you a uniform there." I didn't say another word. I rose from the oak chair. I didn't push the plate away. I didn't throw the brochure. I made no gesture of rage. I simply straightened up, smoothing the skirt of my dress. I walked towards the hallway that led to the bedrooms. Behind me, I heard Robert exhale loudly, saying something about how easy it had been. "I told you the old lady wouldn't cause any trouble." I entered my bedroom and closed the door silently. I turned on the bedside lamp. The yellow light bathed the perfectly made bed, the dark wood wardrobe, the dresser where I kept my photographs. I went directly to the corner where I stored my suitcases. I pulled out a small, sturdy, practical brown leather one. I opened it on the bed. My mind worked with glacial efficiency. I wasn't packing out of obedience. I was packing out of strategy. I packed 3 changes of clothes, a pair of comfortable shoes, my personal toiletries. Then I walked to my workshop, which was connected to my bedroom by an interior door. The workshop was dark, illuminated only by the street lamp filtering through the window. I went straight to the built-in safe behind the spare parts shelf. I entered the combination from memory. 4 turns right, 2 left, 1 right. The heavy mechanism clicked softly. From inside, I pulled out a thick plastic folder. Inside were the house deeds, the property titles, the tax records, all in my name, impeccably up to date. Robert, in his supreme stupidity, had assumed that because I was married to Thomas, the house had automatically entered some manageable legal limbo after his death. He never bothered to investigate that the property was acquired solely in my name from day one, with money from my own family inheritance, and that he had no legal authority to mortgage even a single brick of the exterior wall. I also took out my main toolkit, my favorite tweezers, my loops, the digital caliper, the things that define me. I put the folder and the case in the suitcase. I zipped it up, put on my grey wool coat, adjusted my scarf around my neck, and took the handle of the suitcase. I left the room and walked down the hallway towards the front door. As I passed the archway to the dining room, I paused for an instant. They were still sitting there. Robert was pouring himself another glass of wine, laughing at something, already celebrating his imaginary victory. Susan's gaze was lost on the wall. Neither of them saw me in the dim light of the hallway. I looked at the scene like someone observing the faulty operation of machinery beyond repair. I had spent 3 years lubricating their gears, absorbing their friction, keeping this home running at the cost of my own energy. And this was the currency of exchange, a charity home and a robbery of my assets. I didn't feel sorry for myself. I felt a deep, cold pity for them, for the ignorance of believing they could discard me like old furniture without facing the consequences of gravity. I turned on my heel, reached the solid wood front door, took the cold brass knob, and turned it slowly to avoid making noise. I stepped out onto the front porch. The night was clear, and the cold air hit my face, awakening every nerve ending on my skin. The sky showed a few stars, dimmed by the city lights. I walked along the tiled path to the sidewalk. I didn't look back. I took my cell phone from my coat pocket and dialed the number of the taxi company that operated a few blocks from here. As I waited for the operator to answer, my gaze fell on the street corner, where the sign for Mr. Henderson's real estate agency glowed faintly under a street lamp. My community network was there, asleep but present, waiting to be activated with the first light of dawn. The taxi arrived in less than 5 minutes. The driver, a young man I didn't know, got out to help me with my suitcase. "Where can I take you, ma'am?" he asked, noticing the hour and my light luggage. "To Central Avenue, to the hotel across from Civic Square," I replied in a firm, clear voice. I got into the back seat. The engine started with a soft purr. Through the window, I watched the facade of my house recede. The dining room lights were still on. Inside, an arrogant man and a cowardly woman believed they had won the game. They believed they controlled the chessboard, completely unaware that the owner of the board had just taken the pieces, the rules, and the entire table with her. I settled into the seat, closed my eyes for a moment, and began to mentally review the legal steps and visits I would make first thing in the morning. The time for patience was over. The time for precision was beginning, and if there was one thing I knew how to do better than anyone in this world, it was to dismantle faulty machinery piece by piece until nothing remained but the naked weight of truth. I placed the plastic folder on my lap, feeling the weight of the documents under my hands, and let the taxi carry me towards the beginning of the next day. The door to the house my house had closed behind me, and with it, its fate was sealed. The lobby of the Central Hotel smelled of floor wax and reheated coffee, a mixture that brought back memories of early mornings when Thomas and I traveled to the countryside looking for clock parts. The night shift receptionist was a young, slender man, his uniform a bit too large for him. He was nodding off behind the mahogany counter when the sound of my suitcase wheels on the granite floor made him jump. He rubbed his eyes, blinked a couple of times, and his sleepy expression immediately transformed into one of genuine surprise. "Mrs. Vance!" he exclaimed, quickly straightening up and adjusting his tie. "What are you doing here at this hour?" I recognized him instantly. It was Samuel, Martha's grandson, the same young man whose grandfather's pocket watch I had repaired a couple of years ago. A beautiful watch, a 1950 Longines, that had arrived at my workshop with its mainspring broken in half. "Good evening, Samuel," I replied, approaching the counter with my back straight, placing both hands on the cold wood. "I need a single room, please. Facing the street, if possible. I like to hear the morning sounds." Samuel looked at my small suitcase and then at my face. He didn't ask impertinent questions. That's the advantage of belonging to a community where respect still carries weight. People know how to read silences. He took a key with a heavy brass keychain from the back panel and handed it to me with both hands, as if offering me an object of great value. "Room 204, Mrs. Vance. It's the quietest on the second floor. Don't worry about checking in now. I'll take care of registering you. Can I help you with your suitcase?" "No need, young man. It's light." I climbed the carpeted wooden staircase. Each step creaked with a different tone, a symphony of old wood that I found strangely comforting. Entering the room, I turned on the main light. It was a modest, clean room, with a bed covered in a white quilt, a small desk by the window, and a sliding door wardrobe. I left the suitcase on the bed and took off my coat. I didn't feel sleepy. The adrenaline, cold and methodical, ran through my veins, setting a steady rhythm. I went to the window, pulled back the thick curtain, and looked out towards Civic Square. The streetlights illuminated the pruned trees and empty benches. The city slept, unaware of the small betrayals brewing inside its homes. I took out my pocket watch, a Swiss mechanism I always wore pinned to my skirt. It was 2:15 a.m. I opened it. The sound of the escapement that fast, perfect tick-tock filled the silence of the room. A clock works because each part assumes its responsibility. If a gear decides it wants to turn in the opposite direction, the entire machine seizes up. Robert was that faulty gear, and Susan. Susan was the axis that had bent from cowardice, allowing the friction to destroy the mechanism. I opened the suitcase and pulled out the thick plastic folder. I sat in the chair in front of the desk. I turned on the reading lamp and spread the documents across the surface. There was my life on paper. The original deed from 1978 with notary seals darkened by time. The updated certificate of title, just 6 months old, a pure habit. The property tax receipts, all paid in my name. I caressed the rough paper of the deed. Thomas and I had agreed to put the house in my name because the initial down payment had come from the sale of land my father left me when he died. "It's your security, Eleanor," Thomas told me that afternoon at the notary's office. "Men are birds of passage, but you are solid ground." He was right. I spent the rest of the early morning reviewing every clause, every article of property law that I knew by heart. Robert had assumed that an old woman's silence was synonymous with ignorance. He had swallowed the narrative that older people become invisible, incapable of understanding the modern world of speed and risk that he so loudly proclaimed. But business, like clocks, is governed by immutable laws. Paper dictates, and the paper said that I was the sole owner of every square inch of the property he planned to mortgage at dawn. At 6 a.m., the sunlight began to filter through the window, painting the desk with an orange hue. I got up, went to the bathroom, washed my face with icy water, and fixed my hair in front of the mirror. I put on a clean, sober, dark blue dress and my walking shoes. There were no dark circles under my eyes, no trace of the victim Robert expected to find crying in her room. I went down to the lobby at 7 o'clock. Samuel had already been relieved by an older woman who greeted me with a nod. I stepped out onto the street. The morning air was sharp and clean. I walked with a steady pace down Central Avenue. At that hour, my house used to be a chaos of demands. Robert would be grumbling because his shirt wasn't ready. Susan would be rushing around looking for car keys, and I would be serving breakfast, making sure Ethan had his snack in his backpack. Today, however, the only sound accompanying me was that of my own footsteps on the pavement. Before going to the real estate agency, I detoured 2 blocks to Martha's Bakery. It was a long-standing local spot, with glass display cases fogged by the heat of the ovens and the smell of freshly baked bread flooding the block. As I entered, the door's bell announced my arrival. Martha, a robust woman with flowery arms, looked up from the cash register. "A miracle, Eleanor," she exclaimed, wiping her hands on her apron. "I haven't seen you here so early in months. You always send that son-in-law of yours, or you come rushing in the afternoons. Good morning, Martha." "Routines change," I replied with a soft smile, approaching the counter. "Give me a black coffee, please. Strong." Martha served me the coffee in a thick ceramic mug and brought it over with a steaming cheese pastry. She looked at me with that perceptiveness that only years behind a counter, observing neighborhood people, can give. "You look different, Eleanor. You look like you're going to war, but with your uniform ironed." I took a sip of coffee. The warmth spread through my chest, settling my thoughts. "Martha, I want to ask you something, and I need you to be honest. Does Robert owe you money for the breakfasts he picks up on weekends?" The woman sighed. Her expression hardened, then she crossed her thick arms over her chest. She looked towards the street before responding, lowering her voice. "That man is a phony, Eleanor. I say this with all due respect, Because he's your daughter's husband. He owes me over 2 months for bread and expensive ham and cheeses. He always comes with the story that he doesn't have his wallet, that his investors will deposit on Monday, that his money is locked in an overseas account. I give him credit because of you, because I know you always pay, but honestly, I'm tired of his grand airs. I nodded slowly. My diagnosis was confirmed in every corner of the neighborhood. I opened my purse, took out my wallet, and extracted several high-denomination bills. I placed them on the glass counter. Cover everything he owes you, down to the last penny, Martha, and give me the receipt. Eleanor, you don't have to. Do it, please, I interrupted in a tone that allowed no argument. And listen to me carefully. From this moment on, don't give him credit for even a single loaf of bread. If Robert walks through that door asking for credit, tell him his account is closed, that he pays cash or leaves empty-handed. Martha looked me in the eyes for a long second, understanding that something fundamental had broken. She nodded, took the bills, and began ringing up the total. She handed me the change and a detailed receipt with Robert's name written at the top. I put the paper in my purse with the same precision with which I store a minuscule gear. I finished my coffee, said goodbye to Martha, and went out onto the street again. It was 8:15. Mr. Henderson's real estate agency was just 3 blocks away, on a prime corner of the main boulevard. When I arrived, Mr. Henderson was lifting the metal shutter of his office. He was a 75-year-old man, impeccably postured, with completely white hair and suspenders that gave him the air of an old-school notary. Seeing me standing on the sidewalk, with my plastic folder under my arm, he stopped his task and adjusted his glasses. "Eleanor, what a surprise," he said, approaching to give me a kiss on the cheek. Come in, it's cold out here." I was just about to make the first pot of coffee of the day. "I've already had coffee, Elias, but I'll take the warmth of your office. I need to talk to you urgently." We entered the office. It was an organized place, full of metal filing cabinets, zoning maps on the walls, and a large meeting table in the center. Elias turned on the lights, took off his coat, and sat behind his desk, motioning for me to take the seat opposite him. He noticed my rigid posture and the way I clutched the folder. "You're not here to talk about old times, are you?" he asked, interlacing his fingers on the table, his tone immediately becoming professional. "What's wrong, Eleanor?" I placed the folder on his desk and opened it. The smell of old paper filled the space between us. "Robert threw an assisted living brochure at me last night," I began bluntly, my voice even. "He ordered me to pack my bags because he was sending me there first thing today. He said the house is too big for me, that I'm an impediment to the family's progress, and that today he's going to mortgage the property to inject capital into a phantom project." Mr. Henderson's eyes widened. His jaw tensed, and a flush of indignation rose up his neck. He knew Thomas. He knew the effort it had cost us to build those walls. That scoundrel dared to do such a thing, he muttered, hitting the table with the palm of his hand. "And Susan, what did your daughter say about this outrage?" Susan was sitting next to him, staring at the tablecloth. She agreed. She said it was for the best for everyone, and that they would visit me on Sundays. Elias closed his eyes for an instant, assimilating the magnitude of the betrayal. Then he opened his eyes and looked at the folder. "But he can't mortgage anything, Eleanor. The house is in your name. I know that perfectly well because I personally advised you when you bought the land in 78. I know, but he doesn't know. Or he believes that since I'm a widow, the property entered some succession he can manipulate. He assumes I'll sign any paper he puts in front of me out of pure intimidation." Mr. Henderson frowned, a gesture of absolute concentration. He spun his chair towards the desktop computer beside him, put on his reading glasses, and began to type rapidly. "Let's check the public property registry system. I have direct access to the notaries and banks' databases. If that idiot is pulling strings, the trail has to appear here." The silence in the office was interrupted only by Elias's typing and the sound of the heater kicking on. I remained still, observing his profile. For 3 years, Robert had strutted around my house like a peacock, talking about business, contacts, market strategies, disparaging my clockmaking trade. He was about to discover that true power networks are not built at elegant dinners with borrowed money, but in decades of trust, in sincere handshakes, and in the shared memory of a neighborhood. "Here it is," Elias suddenly said, his voice laden with deep disgust. Eleanor, look at this. I got up and walked around the desk to look at the screen. There was a digital form with the seal of a dubious financial company, one of those that grant quick loans with usurious interest in exchange for real estate collateral. Yesterday afternoon, they submitted an application for pre-approval for a mortgage loan using your house address, Elias explained, pointing with his index finger at the filled fields on the screen. Robert is listed as the primary applicant. And look at this. Here, in the financial advisor's remarks, it says, the client claims to have broad and sufficient power of attorney over the owner, who is in the process of being declared incapacitated due to senile dementia. I felt a sudden coldness in the pit of my stomach. It wasn't pain. It was the absolute understanding of the depravity he had reached. He was going to lock me up in the nursing home, not only to get me out of the way, but to use that confinement as proof of my supposed mental incapacity, giving him free rein to plunder my assets with a fake or forced power of attorney. Declaration of incapacity, I murmured, savoring the venomous words. That was the complete plan. That's why the hurry, that's why the cheapest, most isolated nursing home. That's a federal crime, Eleanor. Attempted fraud, false statements, elder abuse. The list is long, Elias said, turning from the screen and looking directly into my eyes. The process is stalled in the system because the financial company requires the original deeds and your in-person signature before their notary to release the funds. That's why he demanded you sign today before leaving. I returned to my chair and sat down slowly. A clockmaker knows that when a broken part is discovered, it shouldn't be struck in fury. It must be extracted with surgical precision, so as not to damage the rest of the mechanism. I'm not going to let them get away with it, Elias. I'm not going to argue with them. I'm not going to cry or ask for explanations. What do you want to do? I can call the police right now. No, I replied, raising a hand. The police would scare him, but it wouldn't solve the root problem. He would still be living in my house. Susan would still be justifying him. Robert said last night that the house was too big for me. He said I was an impediment to his progress. I want to give him exactly what he asked for. Elias looked at me curiously, leaning forward. I want to sell the house, Elias, today. The real estate agent blinked, surprised by the bluntness of my decision. Sell it, Eleanor? It's your home. You have your whole life there. My life is in my tools and in my head, Elias. That house, with them in it, has become an empty shell. If I don't cut ties cleanly, they'll keep draining my energy until I really do end up in a nursing home. I want to put it up for sale immediately, and I want them out of there. A slow, sharp smile began to spread across Mr. Henderson's face. He took off his glasses and placed them on the table. Eleanor, I don't know if you're aware, but your street's zoning changed 8 months ago. The city council approved the construction of low-density commercial buildings on that block. I have a construction company, the Arango Group, that's been calling me every 2 weeks, asking about your property. They want that corner to build a boutique commercial plaza. They'd pay cash, no mortgages, no delays, and for a value 3 times what you think that house is worth. The information landed on the table with the weight of a gold ingot. Robert wanted to mortgage the house for pennies to a second-rate financial company to save a failed business. He was completely unaware that he was sitting on a gold mine of commercial real estate, simply because he never bothered to talk to the neighbors, never read the city notices, never looked beyond his own inflated ego. Call the Arango Group, I said, feeling an absolute calm wash over me. Tell them the property is available and the deal closes today if they bring the paperwork. At that precise moment, the silence in the office was ripped apart by the ring of my cell phone. I took it out of my coat pocket. On the screen, Susan's name glowed. I looked at Elias and gestured for him to be silent. I swiped my finger across the screen and brought the phone to my ear. Hello? I answered in a neutral voice. Where the hell did you go, Eleanor? The voice wasn't Susan's, it was Robert's. He sounded agitated, breathing heavily, almost shouting. I went into your room to take you to the notary, and you're not there. You took your clothes. Where's the folder with the papers? I pulled the phone slightly away from my ear. I could hear raw panic vibrating in his vocal cords. His house of cards was trembling. I left early, Robert. I had errands to run, I replied with exasperating calm. What errands? You're going to the nursing home today. The financial representative and the notary are arriving at the house in half an hour. I need you to sign those transfer papers immediately. You're ruining my schedule, you stupid old woman. Get back to the house right now. In the background, I could hear my daughter's trembling voice. Robert, please, don't yell at her. Mom, where are you? Come home. Let's talk. Susan's plea caused a pang in my chest, but I stifled it immediately. It was too late to talk. You told me last night that everything is about speed, Robert, I said, enunciating each word with crystal clarity, that everything is a risk. You told me I was stuck in the last century. I'm just following your advice. I'm moving fast. What are you talking about? He bellowed, completely losing control. If you don't come back and sign those papers, I swear to God I'll come find you and drag you to that nursing home myself. You're senile. You don't know what you're doing. I know exactly what I'm doing. I'm solving the problem of the house being too big for me. Wait for me there. See you soon. I hung up before he could respond. I turned off the phone and placed it on the table. Elias, who had heard the shouting through the receiver, looked at me with a mixture of respect and astonishment. That man is desperate, Elias commented, shaking his head. If he has the financial notary coming to your house, it's because he expected to have you cornered, frightened, ready to sign without reading. But you're not there, and neither are the papers. Elias jumped up, suddenly injected with youthful energy. I'm going to call Dr. Evelyn Hayes, my go-to attorney. She's relentless. I'll ask her to come immediately. We'll draft an absolute sales mandate in my name and an immediate eviction notice for attempted fraud and elder financial abuse. If he's already called a crooked notary to your house, we'll arrive with the law in hand and the rightful owner. He nodded and picked up his desk phone. While he spoke rapidly with the lawyer, I got up and walked towards the agency's large window. The city was already fully awake. Cars sped by. People walked to their jobs, oblivious to the silent battle unfolding in that office. I thought of the stew I had left on the table last night. I thought of Robert's ironed shirts. I thought of Susan's complicit silence. I had spent 3 years being the invisible servant in my own house, allowing myself to be treated like old furniture about to be discarded. Dr. Evelyn Hayes arrived 15 minutes later. She was a woman in her 50s, dressed in an impeccable pantsuit, carrying a black leather briefcase. She entered like an efficient gust of wind. Elias quickly introduced us and summarized the situation, showing her the record of the attempted fraud on the screen. The lawyer reviewed my deeds with a critical eye. Impeccable, she declared, closing the folder. Mrs. Vance, what your son-in-law attempted to do is a serious crime. But beyond the criminal aspect, from a civil standpoint, he is merely a precarious occupant on your property. He has no lease agreement, no possession rights. And with this attempted fraud, he loses any consideration of courtesy. I want to sell the property to the Arango Group today, Doctor, and I want Robert and his family out of the house by noon. Doctor, Hayes nodded, took out her laptop, and began drafting documents at dizzying speed. We will sign an irrevocable purchase agreement with the construction company. Elias will ensure that the Arango representative is ready. Simultaneously, we will sign an extrajudicial eviction order. Since the property is being commercially transferred and there is evidence of attempted dispossession, the law allows us to demand immediate vacating. And if he resists, we'll call law enforcement with the order in hand. I signed every document Dr. Hayes placed in front of me. My pulse was that of a surgeon. My hand didn't tremble for a second. With each stroke of my pen, I dismantled Robert's castle of lies. With each signature, I struck back with the same force, but with the weight of legality that he so despised. When we finished, Elias took the documents and put them in his briefcase. Then he walked to a cabinet at the back of the office, opened it, and pulled out a large corrugated plastic sign. It had bright red letters printed on a white background. Commercial property for sale. Elias looked at me and smiled. Robert said he needed to host important clients at the house today, didn't he? Elias asked, adjusting his suspenders. That's what he said, to inject capital into his project. Well, we're going to bring him the most important clients he'll ever have, Elias said, grabbing his car keys. The new owners of the property. The 3 of us left the office together. Dr. Hayes walked to my left. Mr. Henderson to my right, carrying the sign. The morning sun shone brightly overhead, dissolving the chill of the dawn. We got into Elias's car. The drive to my house would take less than 10 minutes. I settled into the back seat, smoothing the skirt of my dress. The machinery was in motion. The gears turned with lethal precision, and time, that resource Robert believed he controlled, was about to run out completely for him. I clutched my pocket watch between my hands, feeling its steady beat, preparing to open the door of my own house for the very last time. The drive in Mr. Henderson's car lasted exactly 9 minutes and 40 seconds. I measured it by the constant vibration of my pocket watch, resting against the fabric of my skirt, marking the pulse of a morning that no longer belonged to the realm of routine, but to that of dissection. Through the window, I watched the streets of my neighborhood pass at a moderate speed. I knew every crack in the sidewalks, every tree whose roots had lifted the concrete over the decades. These were streets built by people who understood the value of foundations, of slow and silent work. Quite the opposite of my son-in-law's paper-thin philosophy. In the passenger seat, Dr. Evelyn Hayes reviewed the documents we had just printed. The rustle of the pages was crisp, dry, professional. I hadn't exchanged many words with her since we left the agency, but it wasn't necessary. I recognize people who operate on the same frequency as I do without dramatics, adhering to facts, calibrated to function under pressure. Mr. Henderson drove with both hands gripping the steering wheel, his jaw tense, projecting an indignation that I myself had decided to encapsulate. He felt the affront as his own. After all, he had been there when Thomas and I signed the purchase of that vacant lot that would later become my home. As we turned the corner onto my street, I saw it parked right in front of my house, taking up the curb space with careless arrogance. It was a black sedan, a recent model, but covered in a fine layer of dust. It wasn't Robert's car, whose vehicle had been repossessed a year ago. It was the transport of the trap. That must be the financial company's notary, Elias murmured, stopping his car a few yards back, next to the enormous oak tree that shaded the sidewalk. They arrived early. Con artists are always punctual when they smell blood, Dr. Hayes replied, placing the papers in her black leather briefcase and closing the metal clasp with a snap that sounded like a final judgment. Mrs. Vance, I remind you of our strategy. You don't engage in debates. You are the legitimate owner exercising your right. I will be your legal voice. Mr. Henderson is the witness and the broker. Don't let them provoke you. Don't worry, Doctor, I said, opening the car door. They lost the power to provoke me a long time ago. I stepped out of the vehicle. The morning air still held an icy edge. I walked towards the wrought iron gate of my house, the same one Thomas painted every 2 summers. Behind me, I heard the firm footsteps of the lawyer and the sound of Elias's car trunk opening to retrieve the corrugated plastic sign. I didn't stop to wait for them. I took my key from my purse, slid it into the lock of the outer gate, and opened it without a sound. The front garden was exactly as I had left it, the rose bushes pruned, the grass damp with dew. I climbed the 3 steps to the porch. I could hear voices coming from the dining room. Robert's voice, loud, affected, using that tone of false camaraderie he reserved for people he planned to use. He spoke of projections, cash flow, a brilliant future built on thin air. I inserted the main key into the heavy, solid wood door. The mechanism turned with its usual smoothness. I pushed the door open. The entryway greeted me with the familiar scent of floor wax and freshly brewed coffee. At the end of the hallway, in the dining room, the scene was set like a painting of bad taste. Robert stood, serving coffee in my fine porcelain cups, wearing a grey suit that was slightly too tight. Seated at the head of my oak table, occupying the place that used to be Thomas's, was a man in his 50s, looking sweaty despite the cold, in a cheap suit, with an open briefcase from which thick wads of paper protruded. And in the corner, hunched in a chair by the display cabinet, was Susan, holding a cup with both hands, staring into the dark liquid as if she could find an emergency exit there. The sound of my footsteps on the hardwood made all 3 turn their heads almost in unison. Robert's smile froze. The glass coffee pot remained suspended in the air for a second before he abruptly lowered it onto the table, spilling a few drops on the embroidered tablecloth. Finally, you show up," he exclaimed, taking 2 steps towards me, puffing out his chest to reclaim his false authority. "I thought you got lost on the street, Eleanor. I told you not to go out. Mr. Morales has been waiting for you for 20 minutes. The man at the table adjusted his glasses and gave me a condescending smile, one reserved for small children or for the elderly who are considered mentally absent. "Good morning, Mrs. Vance," said Mr. Morales with an oily voice. "Your son-in-law mentioned you went for your morning walk. It's good to walk. Helps with circulation. Come, sit here with me. We just need a couple of little signatures to sort out the house matters, and then you can peacefully go to your new home. We have everything ready for your transfer." I didn't answer immediately. My gaze traveled from the sweaty face of the supposed notary to the table. There, spread across the tablecloth, were 3 sets of documents. Although I was several steps away, my eyes, trained for decades to read the minuscule inscriptions on Swiss watch dials, caught the keywords in the headings. Broad power of attorney, transfer of property rights, and peeking out from under a staple, a document with the letterhead of a private clinic I had never set foot in, cognitive evaluation certificate. I felt an absolute stillness descend upon me. It was the same concentration I experienced when I managed to isolate the defective part within a complex mechanism. The false certificate was the final proof. They had bought off a doctor to declare me incapacitated. Susan, my own daughter, had agreed to sign a paper declaring me mentally unsound, just to avoid facing her husband's anger and failure. I looked at Susan. She glanced up for a microsecond, her eyes injected with a mixture of guilt and terror, and then glued her gaze back to her cup. In that fleeting instant, my mind raced back in time with the force of a released spring. I saw her at 10 years old. She had entered my workshop without permission, looking for scissors, and in her childish clumsiness, she had knocked over a 19th century French carriage clock I was restoring. The glass shattered. The enamel dial cracked. Instead of telling me, Susan swept up the shards, hid the clock behind some boxes, and pretended nothing had happened. I spent 3 days searching for the piece, distraught over the loss of an item that wasn't mine. When I finally found it and confronted her, she didn't cry with repentance. She cried because she had been discovered. She clung to Thomas's legs, saying it had been the wind, or the cat, anything but taking responsibility. That night, Thomas sat with her on the edge of her bed and told her something I never forgot. "The crystal protects the hands, Susan. If you break the crystal and hide it, dust gets into the machine. Without truth, the hands stop, and the clock dies. Lies always destroy the mechanism from the inside." She nodded that night, but she never learned the lesson. She grew up evading consequences, always seeking a shield to protect her from reality. And that shield ended up being Robert, a man built entirely of lies, a machine full of dust and broken parts. My love for her hadn't disappeared, but in that moment, I understood that a mother's love cannot repair a clock that her own daughter insists on smashing with a hammer. I accepted the fracture, closed the door to my compassion, and left only the cold precision of justice. "I will not sit down, Mr. Morales," I said, my voice clear and firm, echoing in the dining room's acoustics, "and I will not sign anything." Robert let out a dry, forced laugh. "Eleanor, please don't start with your episodes. We talked about this last night. You're not in a position to make decisions anymore." He turned to the notary with a simulated apologetic gesture. "I warned you, counselor. Some days she wakes up lucid, and some days the senile dementia." It was then that the front door, which I had left ajar, swung open completely. Dr. Evelyn Hayes entered the dining room, followed closely by Mr. Henderson. The sound of Dr. Hayes' heels on the wood echoed like a judicial gavel. Robert's smile instantly vanished. His eyes darted from the lawyer to Elias's familiar face. "What is the meaning of this?" Robert demanded, his voice losing some of its volume. "What is this man doing in my house? And who are you?" "Doctor." Hayes didn't stop until she reached the edge of the oak table. She placed her leather briefcase on the surface, right next to Mr. Morales' fraudulent papers. She did so with deliberate slowness, claiming the physical space of the table. "Good morning," the lawyer said in a tone that allowed no argument. "I am Dr. Evelyn Hayes, legal representative for Mrs. Eleanor Vance." And this is not your house, Mr. Vance. It is the exclusive property of my client, of which you are merely an occupant without title. Mr. Morales shifted in his chair, suddenly uncomfortable. The sweat on his forehead seemed to multiply. He looked at Dr. Hayes, then at the papers on the table, and subtly began to gather them towards his side. This is a private family matter, attorney. Robert tried to intervene, taking a step forward, attempting to use his stature to intimidate. My mother-in-law has a medical diagnosis. She is not in full possession of her mental faculties. We, as her family, are looking after her financial well-being. I suggest you leave before I call the police for trespassing. Doctor Hayes didn't even blink. She opened her briefcase and pulled out a blue folder. Please, do call the police, Hayes replied, extending her hand towards the landline phone resting on the side table. It would save us the trouble of going to the police station to file the criminal complaint for attempted fraud, falsification of medical documents, and attempted dispossession against an elder person. Crimes which, by the way, carry prison sentences without bail in this state. Silence fell over the dining room with the weight of a lead slab. The tick-tock of the wall clock, my perfectly calibrated pendulum clock, became the only sound in the room. Dr. Hayes' gaze then shifted to the man seated at the table. Mr. Morales, I presume? She said, reading the name on the folder the man was trying to hide. I know all the notaries registered in this district, and your face is not familiar to me, which leads me to deduce that you are a broker for some third-tier financial company operating outside jurisdiction and facilitating signatures under coercion. Am I wrong? Morales swallowed so hard that his Adam's apple seemed to jump. He knew he had been cornered. In the world of petty con artists, the primary rule is the survival of the cowardly. When the light turns on, the cockroaches scatter. I was only hired to certify mutual signatures, Morales stammered, standing up hastily, stuffing the documents into his briefcase with trembling hands. I was assured that the owner was in full agreement and that the medical certificate was legitimate. If there's a conflict of interest or a pending legal issue, I'm leaving immediately. My financial company does not participate in litigation of this nature. Morales, sit down, Robert yelled, panic finally seeping through his facade of control. You're not going anywhere. We have an agreement. The loan is already pre-approved. The loan is cancelled, sir, Morales retorted, snapping his briefcase shut. Solve your family problems. Excuse me. Morales didn't even look at me as he passed by. He strode quickly down the hallway and exited through the front door, leaving it open. Seconds later, we heard the engine of his black sedan start and the tires squeal against the asphalt. Robert's house of cards had collapsed in less than 3 minutes. I saw him breathe with difficulty, his fists clenched at his sides. His mind, accustomed to manipulating reality at will, was short-circuiting as it faced an immovable force. He turned to me, his face red, the veins in his neck bulging. You did this, he bellowed, losing all trace of the false respect he used as a mask. You selfish old woman, you ruined my only chance to save this family. Without that money, we're going to lose everything. I was going to multiply that capital. I was going to give us a real life, not this dumpy old neighborhood misery. No, Robert, I intervened, taking a step towards him. My voice was low but cutting, like the edge of a scalpel. You weren't going to save anyone. You were going to patch up the holes of your own incompetence with the bricks of my house. You were going to steal the only secure asset your wife and son have to continue playing the successful businessman. You are a broken mechanism, and I do not allow defective parts on my property. Susan whimpered from her corner. It was a pathetic, high-pitched sound. Mom, please, she pleaded, finally getting up from her chair with her hands clasped in front of her chest. You have to understand, we were desperate. Robert swore to me the business would work this time, that the nursing home would only be for a few months until we bought a new apartment with the profits. You don't understand business, Mom. It's all a risk. I looked at her, truly looked, searching for any trace of the adult woman she should be, and only found a frightened child hiding broken glass. Risk is taken with your own money, Susan, I replied, without altering my expression. When it's taken with someone else's money, secretly and under false pretenses, it's not called business, it's called theft. and the fact that you are willing to lock me in a charity home to fund his delusions is a bill I will not pay." Robert, in a last-ditch attempt to regain control through sheer aggression, slammed his fists on the table, making the porcelain cups jump. "Well, we're not leaving," he roared, saliva splattering from his lips. "Let's see how you're going to get us out. We've been living here for 3 years. The law protects us. I don't care what your cheap lawyer says. I'm not moving from here until I get my share." It was then that Mr. Henderson, who had remained silent observing the dynamic, stepped forward. He carried the large corrugated plastic sign under his arm. He unrolled it with a fluid movement and placed it upright on the oak table, leaning it against the centerpiece vase. The bright red letters caught the morning light. "Commercial property for sale. High density. Arango Group." Robert stared at the sign. His eyes narrowed, trying to process the words. His brain got stuck on the word commercial. "As I was saying, Robert," Mr. Henderson interjected, adjusting his suspenders with crushing calm. "You talk a lot about business, but it seems you don't do your homework. The city council changed the zoning of this block 8 months ago. Your mother-in-law isn't sitting on an old house. She's sitting on a prime commercial lot. The Arango Group, the largest construction company in the city, has been trying to buy this corner for half a year to build a boutique plaza." Robert's jaw dropped slightly. The red color of his anger gradually gave way to a sickly pallor. He was calculating. I could see the numbers spinning in his pupils. "Commercial," Robert murmured, his arrogance deflating like a punctured balloon. "How much? How much is this property worth?" "About 3 million over the residential appraisal you were trying to use for your little scam with the financial company," Elias replied mercilessly. "Cash money, no mortgages, no dubious intermediaries. Mrs. Vance just signed the irrevocable purchase agreement in my office exactly 40 minutes ago. The house is already sold." The impact of the revelation hit Robert with the physical force of a freight train. He staggered slightly backward, bumping into the sideboard. The man who boasted of having business vision, the man who called me an impediment and sent me to a nursing home for not understanding the modern world, had just realized he had tried to sell a gold mine for a few copper coins simply due to his absolute ignorance and contempt for the environment around him. Susan clasped both hands to her face, emitting a muffled groan. She also understood the magnitude of the mathematical error. Dr. Hayes took advantage of their paralysis to deliver the final blow. She pulled a document with official red seals from the blue folder and slid it across the table, right in front of Robert. "This is an extraordinary eviction notice for immediate commercial transfer, supported by the fraud complaint already in progress in the judicial system," the lawyer explained with clinical coldness. "As there is no lease agreement, and this is a corporate commercial sale, the new owners, the Arango Group, demand physical possession of the property, free of occupants, today." Robert looked up from the paper, his eyes wide, searching for my gaze in a pathetic attempt to appeal to a mercy he himself had murdered the night before. "Today?" he whispered, his voice cracking. "You can't do this to us, Eleanor. We have nowhere to go. We don't have money for a move. We have Ethan. He's your grandson." He mentioned Ethan. He used the child as a shield, exactly as I knew he would, but I had already adjusted that piece in my mind. "Ethan will not suffer," I said, maintaining my upright posture without approaching him. "I have already made the necessary arrangements for his school tuition to be paid for the rest of the year, and I left an envelope in Susan's name at the notary's office with sufficient funds to rent a modest apartment for 6 months, enough so you won't sleep on the street. But not a single cent of that money will pass through your hands, Robert. The payment will be made directly to the landlord." I took a step forward. The distance between us was minimal. Now I looked at him from the vantage point of my 73 years, feeling the weight of every minute, every hour I had invested in building that home he had tried to snatch from me. "Last night you gave me an order, Robert," I said. My voice dropped to a whisper that filled the entire room. "You threw a brochure in my face and told me to pack my bags because first thing in the morning I was leaving this house." I raised my right hand and pointed to the open hallway door through which the clear morning sky was visible. "Now I'm returning the brochure. You have until noon. At 12 o'clock sharp, the Arango Group's demolition crew and law enforcement will be at that door. Pack your bags." You're leaving today. The pendulum clock behind me chimed 9 o'clock. The metallic, deep sound resonated in the dining room, marking the beginning of the countdown. 3 hours. 180 minutes. The exact time left for Robert's mirage before the machinery of reality completely crushed him. I turned around, feeling the familiar creak of the third step under my feet, and walked out onto the porch, letting the cold air cleanse my lungs as I heard behind me the unmistakable sound of absolute panic. The cold morning air hit my face as soon as I crossed the threshold onto the porch, clearing my lungs of the heavy, stale atmosphere of the dining room. Behind me, the heavy oak door closed with a definitive click, but it couldn't entirely drown out the sound of the chaos I had just unleashed inside. I heard the dull thud of a chair falling to the floor, followed by the muffled echo of Robert's shouts. His voice, now stripped of that veneer of false elegance he so often rehearsed in front of the mirror, sounded sharp, broken, dictating nonsensical orders to a woman who didn't know how to obey them. Dr. Evelyn Hayes emerged behind me, closing her black leather briefcase with a metallic snap that sounded like the strike of a judge's gavel. She adjusted the collar of her coat and looked at her wristwatch. 9:05 a.m. Mrs. Vance, the lawyer said, her voice devoid of any agitation. The schedule is in motion. I've sent a message to the legal representative of the Arango Group. The eviction crew and the construction appraiser will arrive at exactly 11:45 a.m. to conduct the final inspection of the property before physical handover. Mr. Henderson walked down the porch steps and rubbed his hands together for warmth. His usually serene face showed a mixture of satisfaction and contained tension. That scoundrel thought he could trample 40 years of this neighborhood's history with a forged document, Elias muttered, glancing towards the dining room window where Robert's silhouette moved erratically back and forth. Eleanor, are you sure you want to stay here for these 3 hours? I can take you to my office or the hotel. You don't have to witness the circus that man is going to create. I shook my head slowly, tightening the strap of my purse. No, Elias. A clockmaker doesn't leave the workbench until the last defective part has been extracted and the mechanism is clean. I need to pack the rest of my tools. My workshop has an independent entrance through the backyard. I don't need to cross paths with them in the hallway. I'll be in my car, parked right out front here, Elias indicated, pointing to his vehicle by the curb. Doctor, Hayes has to go to the courthouse to formally file the complaint for attempted fraud, but I'm not moving from this street until those two are out with their bags. If I hear a single cry out of place, I'll go in with the police. I thanked both of them with a slight inclination of my head. Dr. Hayes bid farewell with a firm handshake, promising to return before noon, and walked towards Central Avenue to catch a taxi. I walked down the steps and along the gravel side path that bordered the house. The sound of my shoes crunching the small grey stones was immensely familiar. I knew the location of every rosebush, every vine climbing the brick wall. I passed by the kitchen window and could hear the sound of water gushing. Someone had left the faucet running in a moment of panic. I reached the backyard. The lemon trees that Thomas and I had planted looked heavy with fruit, oblivious to the destruction of the home that shaded them. I took the brass key from my pocket and opened the worn wooden door that led directly into my workshop. The interior greeted me with its characteristic scent of polished brass, precision oil, and old wood. I turned on the cool light lamp above my workbench. Everything was exactly as I had left it the previous afternoon, before the nursing home brochure stained my table and my life. The titanium tweezers aligned by size, the millimeter screwdrivers in their rotating stand, the tiny vials of Swiss lubricant meticulously ordered. I approached the cabinet at the back and took out a mahogany wooden box lined with green velvet, which I used to transport the most delicate mechanisms. I began to pack with slow, automatic movements. First the calipers, then the loops, then the small replacement gears I kept in glass vials. As I wrapped a pocket watch bell in tissue paper, the wall Robert's voice cut through the wall, muffled, but perfectly intelligible. Julio, it's Robert. Listen, I need that bridge loan we talked about. Yes, today, right now. What do you mean, no? I told you the house was collateral. Don't hang up, Julio. Julio. The sound of a phone being thrown against the wall made my hands pause for a fraction of a second. The great business strategist, the man who considered me an impediment for living in the last century, was discovering the fragility of his network of lies. His supposed investors were nothing more than vultures waiting to feed on the carrion he promised to bring. With the house out of the equation, Robert was nothing an empty shell. I continued packing. I arranged my precision oilers in the compartments of the mahogany box. At 10:15 a.m., the interior door of my workshop, the one connecting to the rest of the house, burst open. Robert appeared in the doorway. He looked deplorable. His grey tie hung loose around his neck. His shirt was soaked with sweat at the armpits, and his hair was disheveled. He breathed with his mouth open, like a cornered animal seeking an exit that didn't exist. He carried a half-closed canvas suitcase in one hand. I didn't look up. I picked up some tweezers and retrieved a minuscule screw from the table to store it in a test tube. You can't do this to us," Robert gasped, advancing 2 steps into the workshop, his voice stripped of that deafening arrogance, now reduced to a desperate hiss. "You can't throw us out onto the street. It's illegal. I'll sue you. I'll go to court and prove that you're senile, that this sale was a fraud." I finished screwing the cap onto the test tube, placed it in its corresponding slot within the box, and finally turned my head to look at him. "To go to court, Robert, you need money to pay a lawyer," I replied, my voice maintaining the low, steady volume of a ticking clock. "And you just spent your last pennies paying that fake notary who fled out my front door. Furthermore, the property transfer is already registered and sealed by the construction company. You have absolutely nothing to fight with." He dropped the canvas suitcase. It fell to the floor with a dull thud, revealing that inside it only contained a pile of wrinkled suits and designer shoes he hadn't finished paying for. "I am your daughter's husband," he shouted, hitting the door frame with his open palm, attempting to resort to physical intimidation upon seeing that his legal arguments were dust. "I am the father of your grandson. If you kick us out today, I swear on my life I'll take Ethan to another city. You'll never see him again. I'll erase you from his life." I took a microfiber cloth and began carefully cleaning the crystal of my main magnifying loupe. I did not allow his threat to accelerate my pulse. I had anticipated that move since dawn. "Ethan is the reason you won't be sleeping in a public shelter tonight," I said, rubbing the crystal in small circles. "As I informed you an hour ago, Dr. Hayes has an envelope in your daughter's name at her notary's office. It contains 6 months advance payment for an apartment near the boys' school. But the contract for that rental has a very specific clause dictated by me." Robert frowned, his agitated breathing pausing as he tried to process the information. "If you attempt to move Ethan away from this city, or if you deny me the visitation rights stipulated in that same document, the funds will be immediately frozen, and the lease agreement will be nullified," I continued, holding up the loupe to check its cleanliness against the light. "You will be tied to that neighborhood apartment, living off the charity of the woman you tried to institutionalize until you get a real job to support yourself. You don't have control, Robert. You lost it the moment you threw that brochure on my table." My son-in-law's face contorted into a grimace of pure hatred. He took another step forward, raising an accusing finger, trembling with impotence. "You are a monster," he spat, his eyes bloodshot. "A bitter, calculating old woman." "I am a clockmaker," I corrected him. Closing the lid of the mahogany box and securing the brass clasps, I fix what has a solution, and I discard the rotten parts that threaten to destroy the whole system. You are the rotten part, Robert, and right now, you are an impediment in my workshop. Go pack. You have less than 2 hours left." He stood there for a long minute, searching my face for any hint of doubt, any crack of compassion he could slip through to manipulate me again. He found nothing, only the polished, impenetrable surface of a decision made. Finally, he let out a guttural growl, picked up his suitcase from the floor, and stormed out of the workshop, slamming the door, which made the glass vials tremble. Silence returned to the room, but it was a provisional silence. I arranged my boxes by the back door, ready to be taken to the taxi when the time came. I sat on my stool and looked out the window towards the patio. The sun had begun to warm the terracotta tiles. At 11:15 a.m., the interior door opened again, this time with painful slowness. It was Susan. She wore an oversized wool coat, clutching a cardboard box full of photo albums and Ethan's toys against her chest. Her face was swollen from crying, her eyes red, and her smeared makeup stained her cheeks. She seemed to have aged 10 years in the last 2 hours. She stood in the doorway, not daring to step onto the workshop floor, as if she knew she was no longer welcome in my sacred spaces. "Mom," she whispered, her voice breaking on the second syllable. I got up from the stool and crossed my arms, maintaining my distance. I didn't go to her. I didn't offer the comfort she was desperately seeking. "Did you pack Ethan's things, Susan?" I asked in a strictly practical tone. She nodded frantically, tears overflowing again and falling onto the edge of the cardboard box. "Yes, I'm almost done. Ethan is scared in his room." Robert yelled at him to pack his books. "Mom, please, where are we going to go?" Robert says the envelope you talked about is a lie, a trap of yours to humiliate him. "The envelope is at Notary Office 4 on Central Avenue, waiting for your signature," I replied. "It's real. But I warn you, Susan, the money is in your name. The contract will be in your name. If you give control of that rental to your husband, you will lose everything in less than a month." Susan clutched the box to her chest until her knuckles turned white. She lowered her gaze to the wooden floor of the workshop, unable to bear the weight of my words. "He promised me everything would change," she whimpered, her voice reduced to a childish sob. "He told me that if you signed the mortgage, we would be rich, that I wouldn't have to work double shifts anymore. I just wanted to stop being tired, Mom. I just wanted my family to work." "Your family worked because I kept it standing," I countered, feeling for the first time the ice in my voice crack slightly from disappointment. "I cooked, I ironed, I turned off the lights and water, while you closed your eyes to the incompetence of the man you chose. And when he decided that my existence was an obstacle to his fantasies, you lowered your head and agreed to throw me away. I was scared," Susan cried, lifting her face, her desperation breaking her usual muteness. "You don't know how he gets when things don't go his way. You have ice in your veins, Mom. You calculate everything. You measure everything. I'm not as strong as you. Forgive me, please, forgive me." The echo of her plea bounced off the tool-lined walls. I saw her tremble, clinging to her memories in that cardboard box, and for a fraction of a second, a mother's protective instinct threatened to cloud my judgment. But then I remembered the glossy brochure. I remembered the word impediment. I remembered her complicit silence last night at the dining room table. "Forgiveness is a feeling, Susan, and I forgive you because you are my daughter," I said, measuring each word with surgical precision. "But trust is a structure, and that structure you completely demolished. You can have my forgiveness, but you no longer have my house or my protection. It's time for you to be an adult and face the consequences of the man to whom you handed the reins of your life. And I assure you of one thing. As soon as Robert realizes there's no more easy money or free rent, he will blame you for this failure. Be prepared for that." Susan stifled a cry, closed her eyes tightly, and retreated towards the hallway. She didn't argue further. She knew that every word I'd uttered was an absolute truth she had been trying to ignore for years. She turned and disappeared into the dimness of the house, taking with her the last remnants of the family we once were. At 11:30 a.m., I left the workshop through the patio door, carrying my 2 wooden boxes and my small leather suitcase. I walked along the exterior path until I reached the front sidewalk. The midday light now bathed the street, illuminating the scene with unforgiving clarity. The spectacle on the sidewalk was pathetic. Robert and Susan were dragging their belongings out the front door. There was no moving truck. Robert had no credit or cash to hire one. They were piling black garbage bags full of clothes, poorly sealed cardboard boxes, and cheap suitcases directly onto the concrete sidewalk, right under the enormous oak tree. Ethan, my grandson, sat on one of the suitcases, clutching his blue backpack, staring blankly with a look of bewilderment that broke my heart. I gave him a slight wave from a distance. He saw me and lowered his head, embarrassed by a situation for which he was not to blame. The neighborhood, that community network Robert so despised as provincial, had not been slow to notice the commotion. Curtains in neighboring houses twitched discreetly. Martha, the bakery owner, had come out to sweep the sidewalk of her business on the corner, though there wasn't a single leaf to pick up. She stood there, leaning on her broom, observing the downfall of the man who owed her 2 months' worth of breakfasts. Samuel, the hotel receptionist, walked by with a couple of shopping bags and deliberately stopped next to Elias's car, crossing his arms to watch the outcome. Robert emerged from the front door, carrying a transparent plastic box, the kind used for archiving documents. He was sweating, his face red from the effort and the humiliation of feeling watched by the neighbors. "Don't just stand there staring, you gossips," Robert shouted, completely losing his temper as he noticed Martha's and Samuel's presence. "Mind your own business." In his fit of rage, Robert stepped on the edge of one of the porch steps. His ankle twisted slightly, he lost his balance, and he dropped the plastic box to avoid falling flat on his face. The box hit the concrete sidewalk and split in half with a dry crack. The contents scattered across the ground, carried by the icy midday breeze. These were not the multi-million-dollar contracts or investment projects he so boasted about. They were dozens of envelopes with red collection notices, overdue credit card bills, pawn shop receipts, and brochures for quick loan agencies. One of the papers flew to land at Martha's feet on the corner. The baker looked at it, then looked up at Robert and let out a dry, humorless laugh. "Well, Mr. Vance," Martha shouted from the corner, her voice echoing down the block. "Looks like your foreign investors are sending you nothing but collection notices. Let's see if you can pay me for those cheese pastries you ate for free." Robert's face went from red to purple. He crouched on the sidewalk, pathetically crawling to try and catch the papers the wind was scattering, trying to hide the evidence of his financial misery from the eyes of the very people he had treated with disdain. Susan ran out of the house and tried to help him, but he swatted her hand away roughly. "Leave it," he yelled at his wife, his hands full of crumpled papers. "This is all your mother's fault, you crazy old woman." Mr. Henderson, who had been watching the scene from the hood of his parked car, straightened up, adjusted his suspenders, and walked a few steps towards the mountain of trash and suitcases blocking the sidewalk. "Mr. Vance," Elias said, projecting his voice with the authority of someone who had lived on these streets his entire life, "I suggest you pick up your trash quickly. Your suitcases are an impediment on a public thoroughfare. And as you yourself said last night, everything in this modern world is about speed." Robert froze. The word impediment, the same one he had used to try and discard me and send me to the nursing home, returned to him like a lead boomerang, hitting him squarely in the center of his fragile ego. He looked at Elias, he looked at the neighbors who were murmuring among themselves, and finally he looked at me, standing by the gravel path, my tools perfectly packed and my coat buttoned. The symmetry of the humiliation was absolute. The man who thought he owned the chessboard was now crawling on the sidewalk, surrounded by his own lies, exposed before the court of the street. I adjusted my purse on my shoulder. It was exactly 11:45 a.m. A dull, deep, rhythmic rumble began to be felt on the pavement, vibrating from the main avenue. The sound of heavy diesel engines. I turned my head towards the corner. An enormous flatbed truck, painted bright yellow with the black logo of the Arango Group printed on its side, turned slowly to enter our street. Behind the truck came a white double-cab pickup truck, from which 3 men with construction helmets, reflective vests, and folders of blueprints descended. Alongside them, Dr. Evelyn Hayes walked with a determined stride, pointing towards the house's facade. The convoy halted directly in front of the property, completely blocking the street view. The truck's engine roared one last time before falling silent, leaving a sudden, heavy quiet in the air. The crew chief, a tall man with broad shoulders, surveyed the mountain of bags and suitcases on the sidewalk. Then he looked at Robert, who was still kneeling amidst his papers, and finally consulted the blueprint in his hand. The hour had come. The clock had struck 12, and the pendulum of consequences was about to sweep away the last remnants of the fantasy my son-in-law had tried to bury me in. The foreman of the demolition crew stepped down from the white pickup truck with the heavy gait of a man who spent decades dealing with dust and steel. He wore worn work boots, a yellow hard hat with deep scrapes, and carried a clipboard with several rolled-up blueprints. Behind him, the other 3 workers began unloading bright orange metal barricades from the truck's flatbed, dropping them onto the asphalt with a metallic clang that sent several birds scattering from the branches of the old oak. The sound of metal hitting concrete was the first real hammer blow to the coffin of my son-in-law's delusions. Robert, still on his knees on the sidewalk, pathetically trying to gather his overdue receipts and foreclosure notices, lifted his head. His face was streaked with sweat and grime. Seeing the men in reflective vests and the immense truck blocking the street, he tried to stand quickly, but his twisted ankle failed him, and he had to lean awkwardly against the tree trunk. Dr. Evelyn Hayes approached the foreman with a firm step, pulling from her black leather briefcase the folder with the sealed documents we had just signed at the notary's office. "Good morning," the lawyer said, handing the papers to the man. "I'm the legal representative of the seller, and here are copies of the extrajudicial eviction order and the transfer of title. The property is legally vacant and ready for possession by the Arango Group. However, as you can see, the former occupants have left personal debris on the public thoroughfare in front of the main access." The foreman took the documents, scanned them with a quick, expert eye, and then directed his gaze towards the mountain of black garbage bags, cheap suitcases, and poorly sealed cardboard boxes that blocked the entrance. Finally, his eyes settled on Robert, who watched him with wide, disoriented eyes, breathing heavily as if the street air had suddenly become too thick for his lungs. "Hey you!" the foreman said, addressing Robert with a gruff voice that tolerated no backtalk or business debates. "I need you to clear the perimeter immediately. We're setting up the construction fence and bringing heavy machinery through that gate. Anything on the curb in the next 10 minutes will be considered trash and thrown into the demolition dumpster." Robert puffed out his chest in a loud, desperate attempt to invoke the arrogance that had served him so well in intimidating his wife for years. He adjusted the loosened knot of his stained tie and took a limping step towards the foreman. "You can't threaten me," Robert bellowed, spitting with each syllable, pointing at the truck with a trembling finger. "I'm a businessman. This is my house. There's pending litigation. If you touch a single one of my suitcases, I'll sue all of you for private property damage and theft." The foreman didn't even blink. He didn't argue. Men who demolish buildings don't waste time debating with termites fleeing rotting wood. He simply raised a hand, signaled to one of his workers, and pulled a radio from his belt. There was no need for the foreman to speak into the radio. At that precise moment, the sound of a siren sliced through the street. A municipal police patrol car, pre-requested by Dr. Hayes as a preventive measure, rounded Martha's Bakery corner and slowly advanced until it stopped right behind the construction trucks. Blue and red lights flashed intermittently, casting streaks of color onto the pale, distraught face of Susan, who still stood beside the garbage bags, clutching my grandson Ethan's hand. Two police officers exited the vehicle. They walked directly to Dr. Hayes, who showed them the court order with its embossed red seals. The commanding officer nodded, adjusted his tactical belt, and turned to Robert. "Sir, the eviction order is clear and the property transfer is legal," the officer said with lethal calm. "You have 5 minutes to remove your belongings from the public thoroughfare and vacate the construction area. If you disturb the peace, interfere with the workers, or refuse to obey the court order, I will arrest you for contempt and obstruction." Was I clear? The word arrest was the final bullet. Robert's machinery of lies ground to a halt with a deafening screech that only he could hear internally. His shoulders slumped. The facade of the successful businessman, of the daring investor who needed a huge house to host clients, disintegrated completely, exposing a pathetic man, cornered and without a single penny in his pockets. He looked at the police, he looked at the foreman, and then he turned his head to find his wife. "Susan," Robert pleaded, his voice broken, extending a trembling hand towards her. "Susan, tell them something. Tell them they can't do this to us. Find your mother. Tell her to forgive me. It was a mistake." But Susan didn't look at him. For the first time in 3 years, my daughter didn't lower her head to cover for him, nor did she rush to patch his emotional holes. She kept her gaze fixed on the asphalt. She squeezed little Ethan's hand tighter, took the handle of her canvas suitcase, and began walking in the opposite direction, towards Central Avenue, moving away from him. She didn't say a single word. Susan's silence was the cruelest and most just sentence Robert could have received. While the workers began unloading the heavy orange barricades and encircling the perimeter of what was once my house, a yellow taxi gently pulled up beside me at the opposite end of the curb. Mr. Henderson, who had been observing everything from his car, came over to help the taxi driver put my 2 mahogany wooden boxes and my small leather suitcase into the trunk. "Everything worked out exactly as you calculated, Eleanor," Elias murmured, closing the trunk with a solid thud. Swiss precision applied to poetic justice. "It's not poetry, Elias. It's elemental physics," I replied, adjusting my grey wool scarf around my neck to protect myself from the cold midday breeze. "Every action generates an equivalent reaction." He pushed the pendulum too far, and the pendulum simply swung back with the same force. I bid Mr. Henderson farewell with a sincere handshake, thanking him for his unwavering loyalty, and offered Dr. Hayes a grateful nod from a distance. I opened the back door of the taxi and settled into the synthetic leather seat. The driver asked me for my destination, and I gave him the address of a small real estate office in the city's historic downtown, with whom I had already been in telephone contact since dawn. Through the window, as the taxi began to move, I took one last look at the scene. The Arango Group's truck was already firing up its hydraulic engines. The orange barricades completely blocked the view of the porch and the lemon tree garden, and there, outside the metal barrier, sitting on a black garbage bag on the edge of the sidewalk, his debt documents scattered around him and his head buried between his knees, sat the man who had called me an impediment. I felt no sadness, no melancholy for the bricks that would soon be torn down. The house had completed its cycle, and I, at 73, was about to begin mine with a freshly lubricated mechanism. Time, like the gears of a well-built clock, does not stop to pity those who try to break it. It moves forward. And so, 7 months passed. Autumn brought with it a biting wind that swept dry leaves along the cobblestone streets of the historic downtown, an old neighborhood where buildings still retained their high ceilings, plaster moldings, and arched windows. It was there, on a prime corner, surrounded by quiet cafes and old bookstores, that I decided to establish my new life. With the money from the commercial sale to the Arango Group, a sum obscene enough to guarantee the peace of mind of 3 generations, I bought a spacious storefront on the ground floor of a French-style building that included a perfectly remodeled apartment in the back. The front space became my sanctuary. Above the entrance door, a hand-carved oak sign with polished brass letters announced Eleanor Vance, Precision Clock Repair and Restoration. The interior smelled of cedarwood, Moebius synthetic oil, and the old paper of calibration manuals. I had installed beveled glass display cases lined with dark green velvet, where I exhibited pieces I bought at auctions, restored with infinite patience, and then sold to collectors who appreciated the value of time reclaimed. My daily routine had become an exercise in absolute freedom. I woke up at 6 a.m., not to iron a parasite's shirts or to cook out of obligation, but to prepare a cup of coffee in my own black granite kitchen, listening to classical music on the radio. No one demanded silence. No one called me an old woman. No one told me the modern world was too fast for me. I was the absolute owner of every second marked by the 50-wall, pendulum, and table clocks that adorned my shop, creating a symphony of superimposed tick-tocks that, for anyone else, would be deafening, but for me, it was the sound of peace. It was a Tuesday afternoon, close to 4 o'clock, when the brass chime of the front door announced the arrival of visitors. I was sitting at my workbench, using a precision lathe to polish the axle of an antique balance wheel, when I looked up through my magnifying loops. Mr. Henderson and Martha entered the shop, shaking off drops of a fine drizzle that had just begun to fall over the city. Elias wore his classic wool coat and impeccable suspenders, while Martha held a white cardboard box from which emanated an unmistakable scent of baked butter and powdered sugar. "What a beautiful place, Eleanor," Martha exclaimed, closing her umbrella and looking around with wide eyes, marveling at the surgical cleanliness and elegance of the shop. "Every time I come in, I feel like I'm entering a museum in Europe. Though I've never been to Europe, that's how I imagine it." I turned off the lathe, removed my loops, and stood up to greet them with a wide, genuine smile. Come in, the water's already boiling for tea," I said, guiding them to a small, round wrought iron table with a marble top that I kept in a corner of the shop specifically for these sporadic visits. We sat around the table, Martha opened the box to reveal a dozen freshly baked guava and cheese turnovers. A gesture of affection she repeated every time she came to see me. I served black tea in fine porcelain cups. Enjoying the warmth, the ceramic radiated against my palms. "I took a drive past your old street this morning, Eleanor," Mr. Henderson commented, taking a careful sip of his tea. "The Arango group doesn't waste time. They've already finished the deep excavation and are pouring the foundations for the steel pillars. It's going to be a beautiful glass building. They've erased any trace of the old house. It's for the best," I replied serenely, taking a turnover. "New foundations require clean ground. If you leave debris buried, the structure will eventually give way." Martha wiped the corners of her lips with a paper napkin and leaned forward, resting her elbows on the marble table, adopting that confidential posture of someone about to share high-value information in the neighborhood economy. "Speaking of debris, Eleanor, guess who my grandson, Samuel, saw last week in the industrial zone south of here?" Martha asked, lowering her voice mysteriously, even though we were alone in the shop. I looked at her without changing my expression, waiting for her to assemble the puzzle herself. "Robert," Martha continued, pronouncing the name with a mix of disdain and triumph. "Samuel went to buy parts for his motorcycle at a wholesale depot and saw your ex-son-in-law working at a car wash on the same block. Samuel said he barely recognized him. He was wearing torn rubber boots, a plastic apron covered in grease and soap, and he was drying the hood of a truck under the midday sun." Mr. Henderson let out a dry chuckle, shaking his head. The great international capital investor ended up polishing tires with cheap wax, the real estate broker commented, adjusting his glasses. "Divine Justice has a rather sharp sense of humor, you have to admit." "But that's not all," Martha added, gesturing with her hand. Samuel discreetly got closer to listen. "It seems the man is still with his delusions of grandeur. He was telling the truck owner that he was actually a financial advisor on a temporary spiritual retreat, and that he had lost a multi-million-dollar real estate deal due to a family conspiracy. The truck owner just tossed him some coins through the window and told him to hurry up with the rims. I listened to the report with the same neutrality with which I checked the wear of a gear. Robert's downfall wasn't divine punishment. It was the mathematical consequence of his own decisions. I knew from Dr. Hayes how events had unfolded after the eviction. Robert, in his infinite stubbornness, had attempted to forge Susan's signature to collect the 6 months advance rent I had deposited at the notary's office. He intended to take that cash to try and revive his frauds, but Dr. Hayes had left strict instructions. The landlord discovered the attempted diversion of funds, applied the cancellation clause I had drafted, and Robert was expelled from the apartment 3 days later, with no right to claim. That was the definitive breaking point for my daughter, Susan. Finally facing complete destitution, without my house to cushion the blows, and seeing how the man who was supposedly protecting her tried to steal the roof over her own son's head, she finally woke from the trance. She packed her things. That same night, she changed the lock on the modest apartment she ended up renting on her own in a peripheral neighborhood and left Robert's suitcases on the curb in the rain, exactly as he had planned to do to me. "And Susan?" Mr. Henderson asked, reading my thoughts with that intuition of an old friend. "Is she still coming on Saturdays?" I nodded slowly, feeling a comforting warmth in my chest that had nothing to do with the tea. "Yes, Susan and Ethan come every Saturday morning," I replied, looking towards the front display window where the rain slid down the glass. Susan got a job as an administrative secretary at a dental clinic. She works hard, travels almost 2 hours by bus every day, and has dark circles under her eyes from real fatigue, not anguish. She's lost weight, but her eyes no longer hold that constant shadow of terror. She's learning to live with the truth, and the truth, though heavy, doesn't crush you like lies do. "That boy is a charm," Martha said, smiling broadly. "Last time they came, he stopped by the bakery to buy you a cheese pastry with his own money, from what he saves. He told me he was helping you clean the clock crystals. That's right. Ethan has a natural patience. He sits on that small stool next to my table and watches me disassemble the mechanisms. I'm teaching him to distinguish flathead screws from bridge screws. He's still very young, but he has steady hands." The conversation flowed to more pleasant topics. We talked about Martha's new turnover recipe, the fluctuations of the real estate market that so fascinated Mr. Henderson, and the tranquility that permeated the streets of the historic downtown. Their visit was a balm, a confirmation that the community network that sustained me remained intact, stronger, and more present than ever, despite the change of zip code. An hour later, my friends said their goodbyes, heading back out into the drizzle with promises to return next week. I closed the door behind them, flipped the sign to indicate the shop was closed, and engaged the brass deadbolt. The afternoon had darkened, plunging the shop into a warm gloom, illuminated only by the amber lamps strategically placed over the display tables. The sound of rain softly tapping against the windows mingled with the constant beat of the clocks. I walked slowly towards my main workbench, located in the most illuminated corner of the workshop. On the green felt mat, protected under a glass bell jar to prevent dust, rested my most important project of the last few months. I carefully lifted the glass bell jar and set it aside. There it was, the 19th century French carriage clock, the very piece Susan had accidentally knocked over when she was 10, whose enamel dial had cracked, and whose protective crystal she had swept away and hidden out of fear of facing the consequences. For decades, I had kept that broken mechanism in a dark box, a silent reminder of the structural cracks that can form when cowardice becomes habit. But now the clock looked different. It had taken me weeks to track down an original beveled crystal at an online auction in France. I had restored the polished brass case, removing the opaque patina of the years with special liquids and microfiber cloths until the metal shone with a dazzling golden tone again. I had commissioned a specialized artisan to restore the white enamel dial, filling the crack with ceramic resin until it was completely invisible, and repainting the Roman numerals with a single hair brush. I sat on the padded wooden stool. I adjusted the articulated lamp so the light fell directly onto the internal mechanism that lay naked outside its protective case. I placed the precision loop over my right eye. I took my favorite titanium tweezers in my right hand and a minuscule vial of synthetic oil in my left. The mechanism was completely assembled, clean, and calibrated. Only the final step remained, the finishing touch that returns a soul to the machine. I dipped the tip of a steel applicator into the oil, collecting a microscopic drop the size of a pinhead with a pulse that didn't tremble even a fraction of a millimeter. Despite being 73 years old, I brought the applicator to the escapement wheel. I deposited the drop of oil precisely at the friction point of the synthetic ruby. I withdrew the applicator, took the small brass winding key, and inserted it into the mainspring barrel. I turned the key half a turn, then another half turn. The mechanical tension accumulated in the spring with a soft, promising metallic click. With the tip of the tweezers, I delicately touched the balance wheel to give it the initial impulse. The wheel spun, the anchor engaged the teeth of the escapement wheel, and then, in the perfect silence of my workshop, surrounded by the smell of old wood and the patter of rain outside, the carriage clock came to life. Tick, tack, tick, tack. The sound was fast, bright, absolutely impeccable, a constant, sure rhythm that filled the empty space within the walls of my new life. I watched as the small brass gears turned in perfect harmony, each fulfilling its function, each bearing the weight of its responsibility, so that the steel hands beside them could advance across the white enamel dial. There were no defective parts, no hidden dust, no unnecessary friction. I leaned back in the stool, removed the loop from my eye, and placed it on the workbench. I rested my hands on my thighs, smoothing the fabric of my dark blue dress. I looked at the newly resurrected clock, listening to its metallic heartbeat, a sound that confirmed to me, with the crushing certainty of physics and mechanics, that time is never truly lost. Sometimes it stops, sometimes it breaks, and sometimes it forces you to disassemble the entire structure to find the flaw. But if you have the patience to clean the lies, the strength to expel those who rust you, and the firmness to tighten the correct screws, time always, inexorably, becomes yours again. And now, every second of my life belonged completely to me.